everyone. Thank you so much for joining this lecture today. I was really looking forward to doing it in person, but alas, Omicron found me. So it'll have to be like this, I'm afraid. And before I start, I really want to thank the RCC immensely for this really amazing opportunity of being a Landhaus Fellow, as well as my fellow Landhaus Fellows who have been really kind to me, especially this week with COVID. And last but not least, thank you also to the Arts and Humanities Research Council who have funded this research, the whole project from its beginning. So today I'm going to try to present the research that formed both the basis for my PhD, but also the two articles that I'm going to be working on while here. And I want to draw out the sort of process of the research, so both in terms of the visual methods that I used, but also how I got to the topic of climate skepticism. So I did my fieldwork for 13 months up here in the rural north of Sweden between 2017 and 2018, so right before Greta Thunberg became sort of present in the global discourse of climate change. And as you can see, it straddles the Arctic Circle, so it can get normally, well, when I was there it was as cold as -45, which I've realised after being at the Landhaus is not everybody's taste. And then normally summers are around sort of 20 degrees, but while I was there it was as hot as 33. And importantly, this region is not just within the national borders of Sweden, but also the indigenous nation of Sápmi. And this, as you can see, spreads throughout Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. And in terms of my research, it was impossible to try and define who is Sami and who is not in this region. This is due to a long history of mixing, as well as problematic definitions being imposed by the state. So a lot of people I worked with weren't really sure of their heritage. Their ancestors had also maybe hidden the fact that they were Sami because of state persecution. So I made the decision pretty early on to work with people who define themselves as living in Arjeplog, basically. Arjeplogere is the name, much as you'd say Londoner or Stockholmere or Berliner if you're Bill Clinton. Something that's very important to note about Arjeplog is it's incredibly sparsely populated. So I think it's Sweden's biggest municipality, or one of the biggest, but it only has 2,600 permanent residents there. 2,000 of them are based in the town, also called Arjeplog, and then sort of 700 scattered around in smaller communities. And someone even counted that there were more snowmobiles than people. So there were like 2.6 snowmobiles per person. And this sort of sparsely populated community thing became very important for my participants when they were contrasting themselves and their lifestyle to Stockholm and the more densely populated urban south, as I will discuss. When I was living in Arjeplog, I was based mostly in Arjeplog town, pictured here. And important to mention, I think, is that I did have a personal connection here. So my partner's father is from Arjeplog, and his grandma was still living there when I did my research. And this was quite a big deal because it meant that I had a connection, a way in, and I could ask the kinds of questions that I was asking, which I otherwise would not have been able to ask as a researcher coming from a London institution. Now, before I sort of dive into how I got to climate skepticism, I do need to explain what visual anthropology is and how I was using it. Anthropology has had quite a difficult history with photography. They emerged kind of around the same time, and anthropologists have used photographs quite badly throughout its history, and that sort of led to a big period where nobody wanted to use images at all. But then there was a kind of turn in the discipline where practitioners really recognised the shared space of art and anthropology and the shared methodologies. And this has sometimes been called multimodal anthropology. And people often make ethnographic films from this kind of turn. But my approach uses photography and really follows practitioners who recognise this shared space and recognise the potential for overlap. And most notably, Grimshaw, Owen and Ravitz, who call for anthropologists to, quote, try things out, even if they yield nothing tangible or seem awkward. So rather than just jumping in, landing in a place, taking loads of photographs and leaving, I really brought images into the fabric of the methodology itself. And one way, as pictured here, was through the exhibition space in a kind of constant photo elicitation. So Nicholas Burriard, art critic or theorist, has talked about the discursive arena of the exhibition, and I really wanted to kind of bring this into a methodology. So offering up my images to really spark discourse about landscape, to explore subjectivity, and it was kind of across scale. So it wasn't just in a big formal exhibition space as here, but it was also just on tabletops when I was doing interviews and really woven in with participant observation and interviewing. A second method which was incredibly valuable during fieldwork was mapping. So I bought a big printed out map of Arjeplog with me to interviews, and then everybody got a sort of laminate sheet of plastic that they could then put over the map. And as they were talking to me and as I was interviewing them, they could draw their routes, their hiking routes, snowmobile routes, where they hunt, where they pick berries. And it was really a way to explore kind of landscape through talking, but also through drawing. And it became kind of like a visualized life history. And I'll show some of the results from this later as well. And then the third and the slightly weird thing that we did together was making pinhole cameras. And people loved this. Of all of the methods, it was the most fun because it basically meant drinking beer in a sauna and then using the cans to make a camera. So there was kind of an element of fun and experimentation to it. And my participants were involved in the making of the cameras, the drinking of the beer, obviously, but also then trying to decide where to put it to get kind of the best view. And that was very useful for me in kind of discussing what makes a good view, what should be included. And it was kind of a play a bit on a kind of Foucauldian CCTV camera, because these would be up for 6 months recording one spot. But no people would be present though, because it was very abstract, as you will see here. Here is one of the results from Uffa's roof aerial. And it's really interesting because each strand, each of these pink lines, that's the path of the sun moving across the sky. So beginning at the lowest in February and then getting higher up to June. And so this is a kind of 6 months exposure. And then this one was from my balcony. And it got stuck in the camera as it was coming out, so it ripped, which I love, because to me that's sort of a very interesting tension between the kind of materiality of landscape and the image, but for my participants it was kind of a mistake. And that was also interesting, like that if an image was kind of broken or ruined, it didn't really fit with the local standards. And then there were things which really didn't work at all. This was my attempt at a cyanotype photogram using ferricyanide to try and make an imprint of something using the sun. And people didn't like these because they weren't detailed, they were too abstract, and they kind of missed the beautiful details that people were used to seeing in more kind of documentary style images. But even the failure was very useful for me because it showed me a lot about aesthetics and about how I should be representing landscape. And then the thing that really combines all these methods, the kind of thing that was running through it, was this idea of sparking conversation. So kind of classic photo elicitation. I would bring all of my images with me to interviews. I returned with a big photo album to my main participants to kind of go through if they thought I'd captured landscape correctly or what I was missing. And to really open up conversations of landscape, which can be a bit abstract just in an interview setting or even during participant observation. And this kind of connects to what John Berger has called ways of seeing. So I use that as a very active research tool to explore the ways of seeing among my participants in terms of landscape and how they were using it. And just to define also how I'm using landscape here, I'm using it following Anna Singh, among others, but what she specifically calls, quote, the configuration of human and non-human across the terrain. So essentially that means it's a lived place that involves humans, but also the moose, the motors, the snowmobiles, the fishing, and the forest. So moving on to really the core of what I found through these methods and how I got to climate skepticism. It's very important to note that my initial plan coming to Arjeplog was not to look at climate skepticism. That is something that organically came out of the research process. My original plan was actually to look at the idea of affect and changing landscapes due to climate change, and to use visuals as a way to kind of explore the more emotive sides of a changing climate. And this was in large part due to the main industry in Arjeplog, which is car testing. So anytime a new car model is released, I think onto the global market, it has to go through winter testing. So it has to have these kind of safety checks. And given Arjeplog's climate and very usually reliably cold winters, is the perfect place because they have these huge lakes that freeze. And someone in the 60s realized that you could actually build ice tracks on these lakes, and miles of ice tracks, given how big the main 3 lakes are. So miles of these tracks are built, and there's a kind of state-of-the-art testing facility, and the community will kind of benefit from that. So engineers fly in from Korea, France, States, the UK, and the population doubles. And everyone moves out into caravans or summer cabins or with their grandparents to rent out their houses for these testers and these engineers. And so that was very interesting to me to kind of think about how that would be impacted by climate change. Here is a view from the mountain looking over the lake, and you can see these kinds of tracks, almost like kind of alien landing sites. And one French guy realized that you could also have a very lucrative industry here doing private driving experiences. So quite wealthy people can come and rent a Lamborghini, for example, and drive around on these ice tracks in a Lamborghini. So when I learned about these industries here, it sort of seemed like a potentially very interesting case study about climate change and changing practice. But when I arrived, it became very clear very quickly that people did not want to talk about climate change here. And even when people mentioned warmer winters affecting the car testing, they were very reluctant to link this to climate change. And I did feel some hostility and quite a lot of avoidance when I was asking these questions. So to really unpick this, what became my whole topic then of why people weren't talking about climate change, we have to acknowledge, as geographer Hume does, that climate change is not just a physical phenomenon, but it's also an idea. It exists in the human mind and matrices of cultural practices, as well as being a physical category. So it's a discourse, it's a conversation, and that means that people can reject this discourse, especially in Arjeplog, as I will show. And as Bruno Latour reminds us, there are only local views of climate change. While you can look at global scientific data, you can view the Earth from space, the perspectives of climate change as in place are always going to be local. So in this case, conversations of global warming and environmental concerns exist very much enmeshed with a local experience of landscape. And in Arjeplog, there was this kind of clash of scale, which became a focal point in my PhD thesis. There was a lot of friction where the national idea of climate change and green energy, which was geared towards the kind of global strategy and conversation, met in friction with local experience of landscape. Now, to understand where this comes from, a kind of major aspect we need to grasp is the history of the north of Sweden. So Libby Robin and Sverker Selin have both written a lot about how Sweden as a nation state, while perceived as quite idyllic from the outside, has quite a problematic history of internal colonization and really cashing in on the north as a resource landscape, or gold mine as it's been called, in the national pursuit of modernity and kind of becoming a world leader on the world stage. So the state started using the north for mining and forestry, building huge naval ships, and also introducing hydropower in the 1900s. Now this, again, was more about being a modern nation state rather than being a green one, but it's now been kind of brought into the national discourse of green energy and sort of, isn't Sweden great for investing in this? But originally it was part of this modernization project that very much viewed the north as uninhabited and wild. And lots of other people have written about the disastrous effects of hydropower and this kind of resource landscape on specifically Sami communities. But here I want to sort of bring it into Arjeplog as well. And here is the impact of the hydropower dams on the local community. This is a very beloved landmass in Arjeplog that was formed during the kind of glacial time, where sand fell down between the cracks of the glacier and formed these quite famous landmasses. And the problem with the hydropower, beyond being a problem for wilderness and birds and fish, is that it really kind of scrapes off the side of this landmass and creates a very visible impact in the landscape. And this is really important, long-term problem in Arjeplog. People have grown up seeing these impacts and being aware of this kind of discourse about how problematic the hydropower can be. And they know that the South uses the land for resources, while as a community they don't really get much back. The tax from the car testers goes back to the car testers' countries. Healthcare is not very well provided for here. So people feel both used for the landscape, but also forgotten in a sense. And this response to the dams feeds into a larger issue that I talk about, which is a local variety of environmentalism following the work of Martinez Allier and Ramachandra Guha. So locals were incredibly protective of the local and visible environment. It was very important that there was no pollution in the mountains and that the lakes were clean. And this follows a general Swedish notion of sort of being in the landscape well, how you enjoy the nature basically, which means you should go into the forest, you should make a fire, you should pick berries, but you shouldn't leave anything behind. It should be kind of as it was found. And there's this idea of sort of the pristine and the romantic in there, of course. And this contributes to a wider theme of environmental stewardship. It became very clear to me during field work that while the global scale of environmentalism was not engaged with, as I will discuss, there was a very tangible and clear local scale of environmental care. And this is where the moose makes its appearance. So the moose hunt was an enormous part of life for people in Arjeplog. It completely takes over the town in September. People set up signs saying, go on hunting. Everything shuts down, basically. And it's very hard to overstate the importance of it in terms of self-sufficiency and sustainability from the land. And also, as you see, they're everywhere in the shops in various forms. But beyond just a way to get something from the landscape, the hunt was also framed as a very symbiotic relationship. So moose eat the tops of young trees, the pine and the spruce, which mean that the forest can't grow. So by hunting, people really framed it as a way to allow the forest to grow and also a motivation to keep it clean. So I have used this diptych here, these two images, to try and show the connection that while they're sort of butchering the moose and eating the moose meat, they're very much thinking about the forest, as well as the food being kind of conceptualized as being the best possible food because it's wild and it's directly from the forest. So that, I argue, is a kind of bodily and moral personhood in a relationship to the landscape. And this is also partly a motivation to keep the landscape clean because people live off it. If you want your moose meat to be clean, if you want your berries to be wild, you have to care for the local landscape. This is one of my favourite pictures, actually, from my fieldwork. It's the freezer of a friend who'd very neatly organised the moose hunt bounty into year it was hunted and the cut that it was. And it just, to me, really summarises this idea of living well from the land, feeding yourself sustainably. And it was also very much used to contrast life in Arjeplog with life in the big cities, and especially Stockholm. So my participants were aware of a discourse telling them to cut down on meat to save the planet, but they felt they were eating as best they could from the landscape. And then a crucial element here is also the sort of local perception that the state was restricting this ability to live off the land through various levels of restrictions if this meat was to be sold in restaurants, for example. So there was this idea they could live off Mother Nature, but the state was kind of standing in the way. And this meant that I started to see a pattern here in terms of who it was that was seen to be interfering with landscape practice. And these were also the people, the politicians, the environmentalists, who were seen to be carrying the discourse of climate change and climate mitigation. And just as an example of what does count as bad practice then in the landscape, people really called each other out on Facebook if they saw litter or if they saw these like dog poo plastic bags on the side of the street. But also this is a very classic example of the sticks used to mark the car testing tracks, which often washed downstream and were then posted online with kind of calls to be better in the landscape. And a second example isn't visual, actually, but those Lamborghinis that I talked about, those are noisy. So the people living around the lakes who have to kind of hear these joyriders screeching past, this was also often called out as kind of ruining the pristine landscape and bad environmental practice. So that was a very, very brief overview of this kind of local scale of environmental engagement that I'm interested in. And to understand that in contrast to the global climate change, we really have to look at how people were talking or thinking about what global climate change was. Like they knew, they'd seen that it was a thing, they'd seen it in newspapers and things. So they weren't denying that global climate change was an issue. It was mostly about who was responsible. So many with whom I worked, when I asked them about warming temperatures, they did this movement through the air like this, as if any climate change of today was kind of contextualized in a natural sort of fluctuation of deep time climate. So humans were always seen as outside that. They were too insignificant to change. So there's a very clear nature-culture divide in terms of climate. And I realized that these sun prints that I made from the beer cans, or we made together, were really useful in kind of actually representing this as a sort of way to play with time. And obviously both of these representations miss this kind of dramatic steep curve that actually occurs in the 20th century that puts human beings to blame for climate change, but people's understanding in Arjeplog was that it was this kind of consistent slope. And I'm also very aware, and I need to make this clear, that a lot of this argument can often be linked back to fossil fuel funded research, which masquerades as peer review. There were even some things I saw on Facebook that were shared among my participants by these Facebook accounts that were linked to, for example, the Heartland Institute. And Oreskes and Conway have worked a lot on this, about the way that this research is put out there to sort of look like science, and then people can get confused as to who's responsible. And then with this in mind, I move on just to the final aspect concerning why people did not engage with this discourse of climate change. And here we come to the motor, which involves a lot of unpacking in terms of emissions, land use, and environmental justice. So many people told me that petrol and oil was necessary in Arjeplog. Given the cold temperatures, electric motors just did not work. You could even see that with the car testers. They could only test the electric cars for minimal amounts of time back in 2017, and they had to strip it of the heating and the radio and everything. So people really felt that the South and politicians and activists were telling everyone to cut down on oil without really understanding that in the North, that's the only way of getting around, really. Whereas in the South, that wouldn't impact very much if people had to use electric cars or more electrically driven public transport. And the maps discussed earlier were a really good way for me to realise this, realising people's reach and how they needed this oil to get around and to be in nature. And here's an image just showing a few of the maps kind of on top of each other to show this spreading out and how people were in the nature, enjoying it, using oil, which is very interesting when you consider how local place was then known, using these ancient ecosystems compressed into oil from Kuwait, Canada, Gulf of Mexico, for example. And also one issue is, of course, cost, that raising the price of oil would then impact the Arjeplogere much more. They wouldn't be able to get around and, ironically, experience their nature if they didn't have the oil. Another issue with the oil is that politicians were seen to be demanding that people cut back whilst also very obviously flying to their meetings. So people saw this and they got irritated, and one of them said, "We recycle, we care for our local landscape, why should we stop when politicians are still flying and granting oil concessions?" So this was all seen as kind of a naive, out of touch discourse that the people making these decisions had never really been to the rural north, or they couldn't see how these kind of mitigation behaviours would actually land. So it kind of all happened in this alterity, this otherness in relation to the urban south. And without understanding the impacts of carbon on a global scale, the focus was very much kept locally. So that was the kind of ethnographic stuff. But then how I kind of had to manage this in terms of an analysis involved the notion of scale very much, which became important in my work. What Bruno Latour has called a problem of dimension, scale, and lodging. And basically how the local was in conflict with the national, which itself was engaging with a global strategy, which didn't sort of feed down to the understanding on the local level. And I use scale rather than different ontologies here because I have a lot of issues with the idea of looking at different ontologies, but also friction allows a much better understanding, I think, of kind of movement and knowledge practices and friction in place. But what's very important to discuss here and in any discussion of climate change is, of course, environmental justice. It's a very important body of literature to engage with here. So Swedes are obviously part of a global system and a very privileged and global north. And their emissions from their snowmobiles or cars or whatever were heading all over the world, where people are dying and livelihoods and landscapes are destroyed everywhere. So while they may not see their emissions, they do contribute to the global problem. And this is a huge question now, right, about individual responsibility, size of the communities, who's responsible. It's a very problem with the term Anthropocene itself. And while many scholars have problematized the kind of individual choice framework in contrast to the massive emissions of transnational corporations, for example, many have also stressed that as a democratic citizen, you do have a responsibility to vote. The politicians aren't going to decide to do any kind of climate change work unless it comes from the electorate. So there is a huge discussion in my work about these different scales colliding. So having whizzed through that, I want to finish up with anthropology's contribution to climate skepticism. It has been examined by science and technology studies, psychology, sociology, but anthropology for a long time chose to focus kind of on vulnerability, resilience, and adaptation, and kind of advocated for a more kind of activistic level of engagement to speak on behalf of victims of climate change. And that is a hugely important body of work, but it can be limiting if we are to ever fully grasp climate change as a global phenomenon and how we're going to get out of this collectively. Because as long as there are people in rich countries and in the global north, we have to understand how and why they reject these discourses. Otherwise, we'll have a key part of that knowledge missing when it comes to future policy. And it's not without its challenges. It is difficult to know how much of a voice we should give to climate denial. I was very worried about kind of spreading misinformation when I was doing my work, and also how much to kind of argue with my participants. But since I've finished my PhD, I've discussed this with sociologists who kind of asked me how I tried to convince my participants that they were wrong. And there's been a kind of inevitable comparison when I present this research sometimes, that people link it immediately to sort of right-wing America, which I find very interesting as a kind of mental leap. But that's sort of how people associate it. But then I sort of found myself going back to this quote by Marino and Schweitzer about when anthropologists assume their studies are going to be about climate change, we must ask ourselves what place is there for these different perspectives. And my belief for a long time has been that the role of anthropology is to understand holistically and on the ground in in-place situations. So I don't believe it's my place to try and change people's minds as such. That's the work of people who are trained in policy and in education. My job is to kind of understand why and how people reject these discourses and how it connects to landscape. And actually, Fisk et al., who wrote this kind of report in 2014 calling for an advocacy and this kind of vulnerability research, they themselves said that a unique role for and contribution of anthropologists is to stand outside the climate change system of prescribed beliefs and see alternative perspectives on climate change. And I don't think that that should exclude climate skepticism as one part of the puzzle, because if we are ever to collectively get out of this mess, then we really need to understand these reasons for people not engaging with the discourse. So I will leave it there, and here are some references, but do please ask questions and also get in touch with me when I'm healthy again and back around the RCC if you want to talk about this more. Thank you.